Picture yourself standing in the marble halls of the most luxurious villa in ancient Rome, watching as wealthy aristocrats bid astronomical sums for what appears to be a piece of living art. But this isn't an auction for a precious statue or rare painting. It's a human being, a 12-year-old boy, so beautiful that grown men are willing to pay more than the cost of entire estates just to own him. His name was Marcus, and by the time the bidding ended, he had become the most expensive slave in Roman history, sold for a sum equivalent to millions of dollars today. Yet within 4 years, this child, who had been treated as priceless, would be dead, destroyed by the very beauty that had made him so valuable. This is a story of how the Roman slave trade transformed children into luxury commodities, and how one boy's extraordinary beauty became both his greatest asset and his ultimate death sentence. The story begins not in the glittering palaces of Rome, but in the war-torn hills of Gaul, where Roman legions were systematically conquering Celtic tribes and enslaving entire populations. Marcus was born around 45 AD to a Gallic chieftain's family, part of a proud warrior culture that had resisted Roman expansion for generations. His early childhood was spent in a fortified hilltop settlement, learning the skills that would have made him a warrior like his father: how to ride horses, use weapons, and lead men in battle. He spoke the ancient Celtic language of his people, worshipped their gods, and knew stories of heroes who had died fighting the Roman invaders. By all rights, he should have grown up to become a chieftain himself, leading raids against Roman settlements and defending his people's ancestral lands. But Marcus possessed something that would completely alter his destiny: a physical beauty so extraordinary that it transcended cultural boundaries and became a commodity more valuable than gold or silk. Ancient sources describe him as having perfect bone structure, with large, expressive eyes the color of emeralds, skin that seemed to glow with inner light, and hair that fell in natural golden waves. Even as a child, he possessed an otherworldly grace that made him seem like a living sculpture carved by the gods themselves. In his Celtic homeland, this beauty was simply noted as a fortunate gift, something that might help him in negotiations or marriages, but would unfundamentally change his role as a future warrior and leader. Everything changed in 57 AD, when Roman forces under the command of an ambitious general launched a devastating campaign against Marcus's tribe. The attack came without warning, striking during a religious festival when the warriors were scattered and unprepared for military action. Within hours, centuries of Celtic independence were destroyed as Roman soldiers systematically slaughtered the adult men, enslaved the women and children, and burned the settlement to the ground. 12-year-old Marcus watched his father die defending the tribal shrine, saw his mother dragged away in chains, and found himself among hundreds of captives being marched toward Roman slave markets. The journey to Rome was a nightmare of forced marches, inadequate food, and constant brutality, designed to break the spirits of the captives and prepare them for lives of servitude. Most of the enslaved Celts were destined for hard labor in mines, farms, or construction projects where their life expectancy would be measured in years rather than decades. But Marcus's extraordinary beauty had been noticed by the slave traders, who recognized that he represented a far more valuable commodity than simple manual labor. Rather than sending him to the general slave auctions, where he would be sold for basic work, they decided to prepare him for the specialized luxury market that catered to Rome's wealthiest and most decadent citizens. This preparation involved a systematic transformation designed to maximize his value as what Romans called a pure delicatus, a beautiful boy slave, whose primary function was to serve as a living decoration, an object of aesthetic appreciation for wealthy masters. Marcus was separated from the other Celtic captives and placed in special quarters, where his appearance could be carefully cultivated and enhanced. Professional trainers worked to modify his posture, his way of walking, and even his facial expressions to conform to Roman ideals of youthful beauty. His naturally golden hair was styled by expert barbers, his skin was treated with oils and cosmetics, and his body was kept soft and hairless through careful grooming and the use of depilatory creams. But the transformation went beyond mere physical appearance. Marcus was required to learn Latin fluently, not just for basic communication, but so he could recite poetry, engage in philosophical discussions, and serve as an educated companion to sophisticated masters who valued intelligence as much as beauty. He was taught to play musical instruments, particularly the lyre and flute, and was trained in dance and theatrical performance. Most importantly, he was conditioned to be completely submissive and accommodating, responding to his master's desires with enthusiasm, regardless of his own feelings or preferences. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more brutal than the physical preparation. Marcus was systematically stripped of his Celtic identity, forbidden from speaking his native language or acknowledging his original family and cultural background. Any display of independence, anger, or resistance was severely punished, while complete submission and eager compliance were rewarded with better food, comfortable sleeping arrangements, and protection from the harsher treatment experienced by other slaves. Over the course of several months, the proud Celtic boy, who had been destined for warrior leadership, was transformed into a perfectly trained luxury commodity, designed to fulfill the fantasies and desires of Roman aristocrats. When Marcus was finally brought to market in early 58 AD, the response exceeded even the slave traders' expectations. Word of his extraordinary beauty had spread throughout Rome's elite social circles, and the auction attracted some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the empire. These were unordinary citizens looking for household help or business owners seeking manual labor. These were senators, military commanders, and imperial family members who collected beautiful slaves the way others collected rare artwork or exotic animals. For them, owning someone like Marcus was both a status symbol and a form of living luxury that demonstrated their wealth, power, and refined aesthetic sensibilities. The bidding began at what was already an astronomical sum, enough money to purchase a substantial villa or maintain a middle-class Roman family for several years. But as more bidders joined the competition, the price escalated far beyond anything that had ever been paid for a human being in Roman history. Wealthy men who owned vast estates, commanded legions, and controlled trade networks found themselves engaged in a financial battle that had less to do with practical considerations and more to do with pride, status, and the simple desire to possess something that no one else could have. The final winning bid came from Lucius Cornelius Balbus, one of the richest men in Rome and a close friend of several emperors. The price he paid, over 700,000 sestertii, was more than most senators earned in their entire careers, and equivalent to millions of dollars in modern currency. For perspective, skilled craftsmen in Rome earned about 1,000 sestertii per year, meaning that Marcus's purchase price represented the lifetime earnings of 700 working men. This wasn't just the purchase of a slave. It was the acquisition of the most expensive human being in the ancient world. But Marcus's record-breaking sale price created expectations and pressures that no 12-year-old child could possibly fulfill. Balbus had simply bought a servant. He had invested an enormous sum in what he expected to be a perfect companion, entertainer, and living artwork that would justify its cost through years of flawless performance. The boy was installed in luxurious quarters within Balbus's palatial villa, given clothing and jewelry worth more than most Romans' annual income, and assigned a staff of servants whose only job was to maintain his appearance and cater to his needs. Yet beneath this veneer of luxury lay a reality that was far darker and more psychologically damaging than the harsh but straightforward brutality of ordinary slavery. Marcus was not permitted to have any independent thoughts, relationships, or desires that didn't directly serve his master's pleasure. Every moment of his day was choreographed to maintain the illusion of perfection that justified his enormous cost. He was required to be constantly available for his master's entertainment, whether that meant performing music, reciting poetry, engaging in intellectual discussions, or simply standing motionless as a living decoration during dinner parties. The psychological toll of this existence was devastating for a child who had once been destined for freedom and leadership. Marcus lived in constant fear of disappointing his master or failing to justify his purchase price. knowing that any perceived decline in his value could result in sale to a less wealthy owner or relegation to ordinary slave duties. He was isolated from other slaves, who resented his privileged status and had no meaningful relationships with free Romans, who saw him as valuable property rather than a human being with his own thoughts and feelings. As Marcus grew older, the pressures of his situation became increasingly unbearable. The beauty that had made him so valuable was also inherently temporary. Every month that passed brought him closer to adolescence and the physical changes that would diminish his worth in the luxury slave market. Balbus became increasingly anxious about protecting his investment, subjecting the boy to ever more rigorous beauty regimens and restricting his activities to prevent any possibility of injury or physical imperfection. The turning point came when Marcus reached 14 and began showing the first signs of physical maturity. Balbus, who had paid an unprecedented sum for eternal boyish beauty, was horrified to discover that his purchase was subject to the same natural aging process as any other human being. Rather than accepting this inevitability, he began consulting with physicians and surgeons about ways to preserve Marcus's youthful appearance artificially. These consultations led to increasingly desperate and dangerous interventions designed to halt or reverse the natural process of physical development. Marcus was subjected to experimental medical procedures that were supposed to preserve his childish features and prevent the development of adult masculine characteristics. Some of these treatments involved the use of toxic substances that gradually poisoned his system while providing only temporary cosmetic benefits. Others required surgical interventions that were both painful and dangerous, performed by physicians who prioritized aesthetic results over the patient's health and survival. The psychological impact of these procedures was perhaps even more damaging than their physical effects. Marcus understood that his master was literally trying to prevent him from growing up, to keep him forever frozen as a 12-year-old boy, regardless of the cost to his health and well-being. This realization destroyed any remaining hope he might have had for eventual freedom or a normal life. He began to understand that he was trapped, not just by slavery, but by his own beauty, and that his only escape from this situation would be death. By age 15, the combination of toxic medical treatments, psychological trauma, and the constant stress of performance had begun to take a visible toll on Marcus's health and appearance. The glowing skin that had made him so valuable became pale and sickly. His natural grace was replaced by the careful movements of someone in chronic pain, and his famous golden hair began to thin and lose its luster. These changes sent Balbus into panic as he watched his enormous investment literally deteriorating before his eyes. Rather than reducing the medical interventions or allowing Marcus to recover naturally, Balbus intensified the treatments, bringing in more physicians and trying increasingly desperate remedies. Marcus was given powerful drugs to enhance his appearance, subjected to painful cosmetic procedures, and forced to maintain his performance schedule even as his health continued to decline. The boy who had once been celebrated as the most beautiful child in the Roman Empire became a tragic figure whose artificial preservation created a grotesque parody of his former perfection. The end came in the spring of 61 AD, just 3 years after Marcus's record-breaking sale. His body, weakened by years of toxic treatments and psychological abuse, finally succumbed to what palace physicians described as a wasting illness that no medicine could cure. Modern medical experts who have studied the ancient accounts suggest that he likely died from heavy metal poisoning caused by the cosmetic treatments designed to preserve his youthful appearance, though the exact cause remains uncertain. Marcus died alone in his luxurious prison, surrounded by expensive artwork and fine furnishings, but with no friends, family, or anyone who cared about him as a person rather than as valuable property. His last words, according to one contemporary account, were spoken in the Celtic language of his childhood, the first time he had used his native tongue in years. Even in death, he was trying to reclaim some connection to the identity that had been stolen from him when he was 12 years old. Balbus's reaction to his slave's death revealed the complete dehumanization that characterized the luxury slave trade. Rather than mourning the loss of a young person who had suffered terribly under his ownership, He focused primarily on the financial loss and the social embarrassment of having his expensive investment die so young. He commissioned elaborate funeral ceremonies, not out of genuine grief, but as a way of demonstrating that he could afford to dispose of enormous wealth in spectacular fashion. But the story of Marcus's death had consequences that extended far beyond one man's financial loss. News of the boy's fate spread throughout Roman high society, creating a scandal that forced wealthy Romans to confront the reality of what their luxury slave trade actually involved. The child who had been celebrated as the most beautiful and valuable slave in history became a symbol of the human cost of treating people as collectible objects. Some wealthy Romans began questioning the morality of a system that could transform children into luxury commodities and literally kill them in pursuit of artificial perfection. Others simply became more careful about their investments, learning from Balbus's mistakes and developing more sustainable approaches to slave ownership that protected their financial interests without destroying their property. But very few Romans questioned the fundamental system that made such tragedies possible, and the luxury slave trade continued to flourish for centuries after Marcus's death. The broader implications of Marcus's story extended throughout the Roman Empire and influenced how conquered peoples understood their relationship with their conquerors. Celtic communities that had previously seen Roman slavery primarily as a matter of harsh labor began to understand that their children faced potentially worse fates as objects of aesthetic appreciation and sexual gratification. This recognition led to increased resistance to Roman conquest and more desperate defensive measures designed to protect young people from capture. Marcus's story also reveals the psychological mechanisms that allowed Romans to justify and participate in such systematic dehumanization by focusing on beauty, culture, and aesthetic refinement. Wealthy slave owners could convince themselves that they were appreciating rather than exploiting their human property. They created elaborate, intellectual frameworks that portrayed luxury slavery as a form of artistic patronage or cultural education, ignoring the fundamental coercion and abuse that made such relationships possible. Perhaps most tragically, Marcus's extraordinary beauty, the quality that should have been a gift enhancing his life, became the instrument of his destruction. In a different world, his physical perfection might have opened doors to opportunities and happiness. Instead, it marked him for a form of slavery so specialized and demanding that it proved literally fatal. His story demonstrates how systems of oppression can corrupt even the most positive human qualities, turning natural gifts into sources of suffering and exploitation. The economic aspects of Marcus's story also reveal disturbing truths about Roman society's priorities and values. The fact that wealthy Romans were willing to pay more for a single beautiful child than most people earned in their entire lives demonstrates a level of inequality and moral corruption that helped explain the empire's eventual decline and fall. When a civilization reaches the point where human beings are treated as luxury commodities worth more than entire communities' annual production, it has lost touch with the basic values that make society sustainable. Modern historians studying the Roman slave trade have used Marcus's story as a case study in how economic systems can create incentives for the most extreme forms of human exploitation. The enormous profits available from luxury slavery encouraged traders to seek out ever more beautiful and exotic children, creating networks of kidnapping, warfare, and human trafficking that extended throughout the known world. The demand from wealthy Romans for perfect slaves drove supply chains that destroyed countless families and communities across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Yet Marcus's story also serves as a reminder of individual human resilience and dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Despite years of conditioning designed to erase his identity and transform him into an object, he retained enough of his original self to speak his native language in his final moments. This small act of resistance represents something that his owners could never completely destroy: the fundamental human capacity to maintain some sense of authentic identity, even under the most oppressive circumstances. The tragedy of Marcus's life and death extends beyond his individual suffering to encompass all the children who shared similar fates throughout the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that the luxury slave trade involved thousands of young people who were bought, sold, and consumed by a system that treated beauty and youth as renewable resources rather than precious human qualities deserving protection and nurturing. His story challenges modern readers to examine their own society's treatment of children and young people, particularly those who possess qualities that make them valuable to adults in positions of power. While we may not have formal slavery, we still live in a world where children's beauty, talent, and innocence can be exploited for profit and adult gratification. Marcus's fate serves as a warning about what can happen when societies lose sight of their fundamental obligation to protect rather than exploit the most vulnerable members. If this story of beauty transformed into tragedy, childhood destroyed by adult greed, and the ultimate cost of treating human beings as luxury commodities has moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Marcus's story do you find most disturbing? The systematic erasure of his identity, the medical procedures designed to preserve his beauty, or the complete indifference of wealthy Romans to his suffering? And if you are interested in more stories about how individual lives were destroyed by the machinery of ancient empires, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because history is filled with people whose extraordinary qualities became sources of exploitation rather than opportunity, and whose stories deserve to be remembered as warnings about what happens when societies lose sight of basic human dignity. Thank you for joining me in exploring this heartbreaking tale of how one boy's greatest gift became his greatest curse.